But we were talking about the transatlantic cable, which that cable was laid in 1898, but it suddenly snapped at about the 40-degree north and 29-degree west of Paris, and the ends disappeared into, what appeared to sort of really be a bottomless sea, and it was only retrieved with very great difficulty. And during the course, of these operations, various other objects were dredged up from the seabed, and among these was a very beautiful piece of rock which was deposited. It's now in the Paris Museum. But once it was dredged up, about 15 years after that, it was examined by a scientist, director of Oceanographic Institute at the time, and the findings about this rock is there's a sensational lecture that was given in the Oceanographic Institute by, I'm thinking of the person named Paul Termier, Termier, Termier. But first, the specimen was of volcanic origin, and large tracts of the ocean floor were found to be covered with lava. And to produce a flow of lava, which a specimen was formed from, there must have been at some time very considerable volcanic eruptions, in that region where the Telegraph Plateau. The second specimen is that they dredged up was a very beautiful amorphous, vitreous, and non-crystalline structure, and it must have solidified in the free air, not in the deep water. It was ejected above the water by a volcano and not a submarine one. So there must have been enormous amount of volcanoes that was above the water as well. So it's amazing that other specimens were of talcite, and according to a mineralogical classification, talcite sort of really dissolves in seawater within about 15,000 years. But the find of this sort of has very sharp contours and appears, quite intact. And that the catastrophe, of Atlantis, it therefore sort of appears to have occurred less than 15,000 years, certainly, because otherwise this specimen of talcite would have dissolved. And the time frame of that rock that was found sort of really agrees surprisingly well with Plato's statement of Atlantis sort of existing around 9,000 years before Solon, or around about 10,000 BC or something. That also corresponds to the mean value of the geological estimates of the end of the Quaternary Age. So there could be no contradiction between the theory of Atlantis and arguments that exist for the subsidence, in the Azores regions. It must have been quite a very sudden and catastrophic geological radical earth change that occurred in that region. I think what we should do is perhaps, of course, we were talking about the adenoids group of asteroids, and they still to this day consist of small asteroids which are circling the sun, and as we were talking about it in our program, they circle the sun really in quite an eccentric orbit, and the planets Mars, Earth, Venus, and Mercury are all intersected by these eccentric elliptical orbits of these asteroids, and that the possibility exists, between a close encounter of our planets and the asteroid, I don't know that part of the program that we were talking about before, and because I know some of it was lost in our first program that we did, but I wonder if what saved is a memory of, of course, on the 5th of, in February in 1936, a member of the group, the adenoids, Adonis, came very close to Earth, about 186,000 miles away, so that's only about 300,000 kilometres. But it just about almost was captured by the Earth, but had it fallen, the effect would certainly have been worse than any nuclear explosion. But it travelled a little too fast, therefore, it was able to escape, more on a slightly distorted orbit along sort of a geocentric sort of hyperbolic path. Asteroid A would have come even closer to Earth than Adonis did in 1936, because it would have been attracted to the Earth's gravitational pull, which bent its orbit in to a progressively sort of steeper parabolic trajectory. It must have entered the hydrogen layer of the atmosphere at around about 9 to 12 miles per second, or 15 to 20 kilometres per second. And at an angle of around about 30 degrees, at about a height of about 250 miles up, it's about 400 kilometres, it would have been surrounded by a beautiful red glow of hydrogen light. And the hotter that it became, the whiter and more brilliant the light that it emitted. But it would have been 20 to 100 times more luminous than the sun, and certainly temperatures would have exceeded 36,000 degrees Fahrenheit, about 20,000 Celsius, and it would have accounted for the fantastic sort of appearance of like a flaming snake that's in the midst of lots of stories of people who survived, who did see the asteroid that was in the heavens, which talks about this huge snake-like god that came and destroyed the Earth and destroyed a lot of the people. In 1908, there was the Targa explosion, and that was also by a piece of rock which wouldn't have been hardly anywhere near the size of this asteroid A, which we've been talking about. But if we could multiply by 200 million times the Targa explosion that occurred in 1908, the column of fire that rose was about 20 kilometres high. That's about 12 miles. It would have the asteroid A would have been seen for thousands of miles, around the region, of course, there's a gyratory sort of motion where how the Earth spins, and it's been slowing down quite radically, it's got ever more slower, even more recently, as we're sort of approaching more of the cul-de-sac of our galaxy, which is the black hole in the centre of our galaxy. I'd recommend that our listeners could look up at the Milky Way to actually see where this, cul-de-sac is. But it just would have been an enormous amount of Earth that would have, been deposited high in the heavens that was blown up of itself. And it would have taken quite some time, which the story is that there was at least 2,000 years of absolute blackness, around the northern hemisphere, which for that period of time there really wasn't any light, as we were talking about. Of course, if we look at there's isoseismal lines, which are lines of energy that's running around Charleston, South Carolina. You can see that it's situated in the center of a tectonic sort of earthquake region. But after some 10,000 years or more of retransformation, there's a lot of superficial silting up. Just to correct, I think, what I said before, it's actually the two holes that's out in the ocean. They are 7 kilometres deep, that's 4 miles deep. But certainly they could have been far deeper, but that things have been slowly filling up. It's estimated between some 60 to 80 million inhabitants just completely disappeared. 8,498 BC, counting in our Gregorian calendar. But if we could just imagine the tidal wave that it caused, and the tidal waves and tsunamis that it would have caused, the Krakatoa explosion in the Sunday Archipelago, it claimed the lives of about 40,000 people back then, and that would have been just completely negligible in comparison to this prehistoric catastrophe. But lots of evidence that can have been was all burnt, by the conquistadors and people that just sort of took over the culture and everything in the Americas, especially South America, which when Cortez arrived there, the cities and everything, he said, just marvelled and were way beyond anything that he'd ever seen in Europe at the time, which was a very, very beautiful civilization. But in the course of a single dreadful day and a single dreadful night, Atlantis sort of really sunk, and at 8 p.m. on June 5th, 8,498 BC, the asteroid A sort of punched extremely huge decisive holes in that fracture zone of the Atlantic Ridge, and all the forces of hell really were just let loose as a result of that. And then these two newly formed sort of vents just caused red-hot magma glowing just to shoot up at terrific speeds, and that would have mixed with liquid above it, all the waters from the Atlantic, and it created conditions for submarine volcanic eruptions all the way along that fracture seam, which would have caused the greatest possible violence to the island itself. And then all the existing volcanoes at the time became activated, and then new vents would have formed. Then terrestrial fire and ocean water sort of just became embroiled in an ever-increasing volume. The chain of fire would have run all the way between the Berenberg volcano on San Mayan Islands in the north to all the way to the Tristan da Cunha in the south. So all that sort of really remained was apparently Noah, who's become known as Noah, and then all the people that just were able to be there with him in the ark. But in the Atlas mountain ranges, they have found the evidence of a ship very high up in the mountains. And apparently the story is that the ship was made out of huge timbers and coated with a pitch, which is like an asphalt. And of course, the evidence of all of that is around this ship that they have found very high up in the mountains. But it's just strange to everyone to imagine it could be a ship, because how could something be so high up, But as we said early in the program, there would have been thousands and thousands of feet of water that would have had to drain off the land, and the island of Atlantis, really was made out of sema and sort of like a basalt type of rock and things. And then there was a seam of plug material over the vents and the seams of fracture zones between the continents. And that all would have burst, you see, and become gasified as a result of the asteroids. And then once that occurred, all of the seal granite of the continents would have all sunk on both sides. On the American side and the African side, it would have sunk as well. And so then that whole landmass would have sunk. But if we take into account the northern part of the Atlantic contains about 48 million cubic miles and about 200 million cubic miles of seawater. That would have been 200 million cubic kilometres of seawater. And about 10% of that volume would have been involved in this catastrophic eruption and distributed over its area. It can have certainly led to an appreciable drop in the sea level. And then if we could calculate around 4,800,000 cubic miles of water would have erupted, in the form of steam. And then that water all would have had to eventually become deposited, which does explain, the Great Deluge and everything that occurred, And then we've got huge watermarks on the Sphinx, showing an enormous volume of water much have flowed past it, which we can see that during that time frame, certainly everything would have been wiped out and everything would have just become mud and sand, after there would have been just a huge sea of mud and things. It could have lasted about 40,000 months or around about 3,000 years, all the stone pumice and everything that was settled over the Atlantic Ocean. It would have been 20,000 times longer than what surrounded the exploded half of Krakatoa when Krakatoa blew. The deluge really is just about a huge sea of mud and water and coarse fragments and things, but it would have been very dense and very heavy and would have rained in ash in the immediate neighbourhood of all the volcanoes. In Naples, in 79 AD, Naples collapsed underneath enormous amount of ash that when Pompeii, and then also Pompeii suffered a much worse fate. There was a layer of ash some 7 meters deep, or I think about 69 feet or something deep. But when we look at the loess-like material and things that's found in areas where the prevailing winds would have dumped a lot of the ash, it's a kind of tufa in which you can find sea animals and algae embedded and congealed from the ash that would have fallen, that came up out of the sea. And this tufa makes up the soil in the Campane, Felice region near Naples. And, of course, there's lots of regions where the prevailing winds blew this, where this ash exists today, and that's amongst some of the more fertile regions on the earth. But the clouds would have been extremely black as night, appeared, in the sky, and all the light that existed would have just been transformed into darkness. A southerly gale would have roared, and the waters would have roared, and waters would have reached the mountains and buried all of the people, in the Tigris and Euphrates area. The depth of the layer of mud could have been, up to about 3,000 feet, or around about 1,000 meters deep, which, there's evidence of all of this can be shown in various sort of finds, very rich sort of finds of all of this layer of alluvial clay and things. But below the tombs of the early Sumerian kings, there's about 40 feet below the present surface. You can find a layer of alluvial clay which is about 8 feet thick, which is completely devoid of any fines. It's as if that was a leftover deposit of some of these torrential sort of water and things that was deposited on the earth. Yeah. But the calendar of the Mayans, probably is one of the more accurate calendars on the earth. We could ask ourselves the question as to what would be the reason why a calendar would begin on that day. But it does appear as if, and it does fit with everything we've just talked about, that this was the island of Atlantis having been sunk. It's interesting that the